Welcome to our 11th class on the book of Ecclesiastes during lockdown in the United Kingdom. And as some restrictions are being lifted, this class was taught on Tuesday, the 9th of June, for the British Bible School in a Zoom class. As we look at Ecclesiastes, we're looking at Solomon's search for a meaning in life. This is the outline that we've been using, and we are finally entering the last section, looking at where he arrives at his conclusion to discover the purpose of life. Before we get into chapter 11, let's have a quick look back at the first 10 chapters. The theme, of course, we've been emphasizing each week. We've been seeing this in every chapter we've been through. The teacher is saying it's meaningless. Everything is meaningless. This is Solomon, we believe, towards the end of his life, looking at his life and not seeing that there's any value there. Everything just seems to be meaningless. As we looked at the first few chapters, we saw that he looked for a meaning in life in the various ways that even we today might look at. He has examined every aspect of life, everything that people might try to find a worthwhile life. And of course, his conclusion after looking at each of them was that this is meaningless. He often referred to it as a chasing after the wind. The last few chapters, we've been seeing Solomon looking at the difference between wisdom and foolishness. And he has decided that as a whole, wisdom is better. But the problem is wisdom can't answer all the questions. Being wise isn't the be-all and end-all. And we saw in this last chapter, those who are wise, those who are foolish, and we saw some things about those who are ruling. So that sort of ended the inquiry section. We're now going to be getting into where Solomon arrives at what the purpose of life is. And as a result, what we're going to see here is a lot more positive aspects, although there's still some downside to it in chapter 11. But he is arriving at that there is something that makes life worth living. So in these two chapters, chapter 11, I've entitled Live Wise Lives. Of course, when we get to chapter 12, we're going to have Solomon's conclusion. We're going to see what the meaning of life is. So in this lesson, we're going to look at Live Wise Lives. And this is going to break down into two sections. We're going to look at the first 6 verses, where he's going to talk about being generous, and then the last few verses where he talks about being joyful. This chapter, like the previous chapter, is made up of a series of proverbs. Derek Kidner, and his commentary in the Message of Ecclesiastes, entitled this chapter, combined with the first part of chapter 12, with this title. He called it Towards Home. We're heading there. We're getting there. And he outlined this section. First 6 verses, be bold. The next few verses, be joyful as we did. And then the first part of chapter 12 is be godly. So he's used some slightly different, but some somewhat similar terminology as well. As he introduced this chapter, here's what he had to say. The pace quickens now. The scene is unaltered. It has the same deep shadows and occasional highlights as before, but now we look at it resolutely rather than wistfully. We know the worst. So much the better. We can now strike out in the right direction. So, let's have a look at chapter 11. Live Wise Lives. Let's see something of the type of life that Solomon sees that we should live. And we'll begin, of course, with the first 6 verses, with the idea of generosity. It does come through here. I'll be reading these first verses from the New International Version. Ship your grain across the sea. After many days, you may receive a return. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You don't know what disaster may come upon the land. If clouds are full of water, they pour rain on the earth. Whether a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where it falls, there it will lie. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the path of the wind or how the body is formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. Sow your seed in the morning, and at evening let your hands not be idle. For you do not know which will succeed, whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well. So here we are in the penultimate chapter of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon is beginning to wrap up what he's been writing about, the purpose of life. And the point that he seems to be making in the first part here of chapter 11 is to be generous with what we have and don't hoard it. Of course, we can also describe that as using what you have. Be willing to let go of what you have. And this seems to be the point of the first verse. Don't hold on to what you have, but be willing to let go of it. And you will find it again after many days. Now, it depends on your translation. In fact, a lot of this first section depends on what translation you're using, how it reads. Sometimes it's due to the words can have different meanings, and sometimes it's due to trying to interpret rather than trying to literally translate. The NET and the NIV have this: ship your grain across the sea. After many days, you will get a return. This seems to have the idea of investing what you have wisely. Although it may here be speaking more of generosity than making a profit. I think it's generosity that is the topic under consideration. Derek Kidner wrote, one of the frustrating things of life observed in 9 and verse. Derek Kidner observes, one of the frustrating things of life observed in chapter 9, verse 11 and following was the fact that time and chance can overturn our finest plans. If that can be a paralyzing thought, it can also be a spur to action. For if there are risks in everything, it is better to fail in launching out than in hugging one's resources to oneself. Let's have a look at this first verse here, this phrase here. As the NIV has it, ship your grain across the sea. After many days you may receive a return. Denny Petrillo in the Truth for Today commentary mentions several ways this verse is generally interpreted. And there's different ways we can interpret this. Some suggest that this is simply a recommendation to engage in maritime trade. I think it's probably more than this, but that's a start. Some suggest that it's a general encouragement to conduct business, to get on with it. Although many suggest that it's an appeal to be generous. We mentioned that earlier. And some see that this is an illustration of living by faith, launching out even though you can't see what the outcome is going to be. And although I think it's more literally possibly the first one or two, I think the point is the last two there. The Net Bible Study Notes commented this: the verb, and it's at least listed there in Hebrew, refers to the action of sending something to someone. This is traditionally viewed as extolling generosity from which a reward will be reaped. On the other hand, some scholars suggest that the imagery deals with commercial business through maritime trade. So it's pointing out we've got both of those ideas there. Hendry, in the New Bible Commentary, expanded by suggesting this: it's fairly certain that the primary reference to the words, as Delitzsch has shown, is to the seaborne corn trade or grain trade. But Ecclesiastes undoubtedly uses this form of commercial adventure to illustrate the course which wisdom suggests in other fields of life, such as the practice of uncalculating charity, to which the words have been commonly understood to refer. So he says that Delitzsch, in his work, shows that this is, the primary reference is to seaborne grain trade. But it's undoubtedly using this to illustrate the way we should live our lives. I think he's right there. By the way, we can also see a bit of what we read in the teaching of Jesus coming through here as well. Remember that Jesus said, it's in John chapter 12, verse 25, "He who loves his life will use it." Don't hug it to yourself, Solomon writes. He who loves his life will lose it. I like that. And also, in Matthew 7, Jesus said, "The measure you give will be the measure you get." And that's the same thing, something similar to what Solomon's saying here, that if you invest it, you will get a return. The measure you give will be the measure you get. So I think these make sense whether Solomon is talking about a business investment or of individual generosity, which I think is the application here. He goes on to say, give because you don't know what's going to happen. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. And NIV and NET are very similar there. The English Standard Version there has give a portion to 7 or even to 8. The New American Standard is very similar there. So one group of translations take the idea that it's investment still, and the other that it's giving away, generosity. But it would seem that this second verse, the second proverb, it's a very similar idea to the first one. Give something to 7 or 8 because you don't know what disaster might happen on the earth. In other words, spread your generosity around because someday you may need to be the one receiving it. That may be the idea of what he has here. The Net Bible very much goes with the idea of investment. It has the idea of investing in 7 or 8 different stocks so you don't have all your eggs in one basket. The idea being we don't know what's going to happen if it's spread around. If one doesn't do well, maybe the others will. The Net Bible Study Notes did, though, point out that this line is traditionally understood as an exhortation to be generous to a multitude of people. And I think that's the idea that Solomon's advising for the way to live a wise life. The third proverb seems to be saying that whatever happens will happen. If the clouds are full of rain, it will drop the rain to the earth wherever it happens to be, and we realize that. If a tree falls, well, whichever direction it's facing when it lands, that's the direction it's going to lie. And I think these are both talking about, and also the next verse, talking about things over which we have no control. But they may be things we still need to decide to do something about. We may have some action that we still need to take despite what's happening. Derek Kidner wrote, the 2 examples given here, the clouds which follow their own laws and times, not ours, and the fallen tree which has consulted no one's convenience, may start us thinking of maybes and might have beens. But our business is to grapple with what actually is and what lies within reach. Few great enterprises have waited for ideal conditions. No more should we. I think this can be very well seen in the COVID-19 epidemic. We made plans at the beginning of the year, didn't we? But now we're at the point, how can we make plans? How do we make plans going forward? Not knowing when all these restrictions are going to be lifted. Not knowing when we're going to be able to resume worship together, when we're going to be able to resume even larger gatherings. The British Bible School governors met earlier this week, and we had to make a plan for going forward. We're in the 11th week of our 12-week series of lessons. So what are we going to do? Well, we could say, well, we don't know. We can't really do anything. But, we didn't do that. Instead, we said, yeah, well, let's plan on another 12 weeks of classes. So that's what we're planning on. And then we've made some plans for even beyond that. Again, we don't know how all this is going to turn out, but we're committed to do that. See, the thing is, we can either do nothing, as our plans might be canceled, or we can plan on the basis of what we know and simply adapt it as it is needed. I think that's Solomon's advice here as well. The next verse, by the way, which is very similar, don't be overly cautious. So the next proverb's an observation on life that can be seen in many people who want to do nothing. He says, if we watch the wind, we won't plant. If we spend too much time trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing, you may not end up planting anything for fear that it'll get blown away. Keeping in mind that the way the planting was done back in this time period and what they were planting is a lot different from what I planted on my grandparents' farms as I was growing up. We planted things in the soil. It didn't matter if the wind was blowing at all. But if you're planting grass seed, if you're planting grain seed, you tend to just scatter it out on the ground. And that would have an effect that if the wind's blowing really hard, I don't think you'd want to plant to scatter the seed on the ground for fear that it would get blown away. But if you spend too much trying to figure out when the wind's going to stop, you may never get around to planting anything. Or, second part of this, if they're needing to bring in the harvest, they'll watch the clouds. And they may never get around to getting the harvest in for fear that it will rain. A lot of times when you're harvesting, especially grain, you need a dry condition so that you can cut it and it can be allowed to dry on the ground so you can then thresh it. And if it's going to rain, that's an ideal time to do it. I remember growing up, it was hay that we harvested a lot of to feed the cows during the winter. And we would watch the weather reports, watch the rain. Are we going to have a big enough dry spell that we can cut the hay, allow it to dry, and then get it baled? Baling wet hay didn't do any good because it just molded. And so, but if we spent too much time watching the clouds, we might never get around to actually getting the harvest in. That Bible study notes commented that this Proverbs criticizes those who are overly cautious. The farmer who waits for the most opportune moment to plant when there is no wind to blow away the seed, and to reap when there's no rain to ruin a ripe harvest, would never do anything but sit around waiting for the right moment. So what's he saying? He says we need to get on with it. Don't be overly cautious, or we may not end up getting it done. Verse 5, I think it's talking about we cannot understand all God does, but the verse can be translated in a couple of different ways. Majority of our major translations, or popular translations today, have as you do not know the path of the wind, or how the body is formed in a mother's womb. And the English Standard Version goes with, as you do not know the way the spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with a child. The problem here is that this word, Hebrew it's ruach, it can be translated either wind or spirit. And the contemporary English version translates it breathe or breath. And that's also a valid translation. By the way, the Greek word pneuma is the same way we find in the New Testament. So, is Solomon talking about the wind, or is he talking about the spirit of humans? I don't think it really matters too much here. Either way, I think the meaning's the same. We cannot understand all that God does, and because we can't understand all He does, how can we understand everything about God? Derek Kidner, by the way, in the Message of Ecclesiastes, commented that he wondered if Jesus had this verse in mind when he was speaking to Nicodemus about being born again. And maybe he had that in mind. He uses the word pneuma there, which again can be translated as wind or as spirit in John chapter 3. His main point in what he's saying here in these verses is that whatever it is, we need to get on with it. We need to get on. We need to sow our seed in the morning, and going with the NIV, NASB, in the evening, don't be idle, because we don't know which will do better, morning planting, evening planting. Net Bible study notes Net Bible, rather, the translation goes a slightly different direction. Sow your seed in the morning, do not stop working until the evening, for you do not know which activity will succeed. So the idea seems to be keep working. And the Hebrew word here for hand, you can see it coming out in the NIV, there at the top quote there, literally carries with it the idea of not stopping work. The idea is that we need to work hard all day long. And the point is that we need to work hard. And of course, the overall point in this section is then use what we have to help others. Derek Kidner wrote, "The true response to uncertainty is a redoubling of effort, making the most of the time, urgent in season and out of season, expressed by Koheleth in terms of the farmer and his work, and by Paul in terms of the spiritual harvest from the good seed of the gospel and of works of mercy." The last section, as we get into it, is going to shift emphasis just a bit, talking about being joyful because life is pretty good. Let's pick up with verse 7. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. However many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. But let them remember the days of darkness, for there will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. You who are young, be happy while you're young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. So then, banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, for youth and vigor are meaningless. So this last part of chapter 11, Solomon is basically saying life is good and we should enjoy it. Knut Heim, in the Tyndale commentary on Ecclesiastes, said, the phrase light is sweet may simply mean life's good. It's difficult to take this claim as anything other than an entirely positive endorsement of the beauty of life. But most commentators still manage to do so. I think Knut Heim there has the right idea. I think this is a very positive statement about life coming up. But at the same time, it is tinged with just a bit of darkness, a bit of negativity. So he says, life is good. Life is sweet, is the way it says. And it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. By the way, I think we can all relate to this, especially those of us who live in Scotland, because when we have a season of rain, and more rain, when the sun does come out, we all want desperately to be in it, don't we? Because we've missed the sun so much. I think it's fortunate during this coronavirus epidemic that we've been living through, the lockdown for the last 3 months, that we've had primarily really good weather, even in Scotland. And we've been able to get out every day, not get wet, and enjoy the sunshine. But we still get some rain periodically. But it's pleasant to see the sun. The term light, by the way, this is from Net Bible Study Notes, says, comments that it's used figuratively in reference to life. And he gives some other references there where it's used that way. By contrast, death is described as darkness, and especially here in Ecclesiastes. So light, it's life, and death is darkness. The bad stuff is darkness. There's another Hebrew term here, which is also, we have a comment on from the Net Bible Study Notes, and that's the Hebrew word for sweet is often used elsewhere in reference to honey. And it comments that the point is that life is sweet and should be savored like honey. I quite like that, because life is sweet and we should be savoring it as well. I also had a comment on the term for eyes. The term eyes is a synecdoche of part for the whole person, the eyes for the whole person. It's used with the idiom to see the sun, in other words, to be alive. Koheleth, the teacher, is simply saying that the experience of life is a pleasant thing that should be savored. Absolutely agree with that. Derek Kinder commented that each joy here is confronted by its opposite or its complement. There's no softening of colors on either side. The bliss of being alive is captured in the lovely sentence which opens with the saying, "Light is sweet." And this youthful radiance may last, as the beginning of verse 8 points out, to the end, but not beyond. It's an interesting point there. So, because life is sweet, because we should savor our lives, Solomon goes on to say, rejoice in all your years. If a person lives many years, rejoice in all of them. But at the same time, remember the days of darkness will be many. This, Solomon says, is pointless. It's meaningless that we have all these days of darkness. But these days of darkness, again, keeping in mind what we just read there from that Bible study notes, that sort of looks on death, that looks on bad things in life. And so it's a possible reference to what happens when we get old, and eventually, of course, we die. That may be the meaning here. So he may be simply saying, enjoy our lives in the sun, enjoy our lives because we're alive, because later the days are going to be dark. Later, we're not going to be here. Or it may just be referring to difficult days that we get throughout our lives. And we do, don't we, get difficult days. Hendry, in the New Bible Commentary, commented, a wise recognition of the uncertainty of the future makes the present all the more important. The present is the only time at our disposal. Tomorrow is in God's hand. We know not what it shall bring forth. It is on today that the accent of eternity lies. He quotes a different work by Heim here. Like Christ's take no thought for the morrow, this does not imply disregard of the future. On the contrary, it's made possible only by a true regard for the future, that is, the recognition that the future is God's. I think we would agree with his assessment. So because of that, because today is all we have, and especially if we are young, we should enjoy our youth and let our hearts cheer us in our youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So Solomon seems to be saying, just enjoy anything and everything. Enjoy all aspects of life. But remember that God will bring us into judgment. But there's a proverb that Solomon wrote that's very similar to that. All a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. And that's very similar to what he says here in Ecclesiastes. Although we should enjoy everything, We must always keep God in mind and know that He is our judge. He will judge what our motives are as well as what our actions are. All these things God will bring you into judgment. Again, Net Bible Study Notes had a note here. It says the point is not that following one's impulses and desires is inherently bad and will bring condemnation from God. Rather, the point seems to be, as you follow your impulses and desires, realize that all you think and do will eventually be evaluated by God. So one must seek joy within the boundaries of God's moral standards. Now, some people think that this is talking about it doesn't matter what we do in our youth. I don't believe that's what it's saying here. Hendry comments on that in the New Bible Commentary. He says there's nothing in these words to warrant the interpretation that Ecclesiastes is recommending youth to sow wild oats, nor can we deduce from them any support for the current idolization of youth with its ridiculous sartorial illusions. And by the way, keeping in mind the date on that writing is 1953, or the publication. So this is about almost 70 years ago. But I would say that's very similar to, we still deal with the current idolization of youth, don't we? And so that's going on there. So enjoy your life. And if possible, he says, banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body. Again, depending on which translation you're using, it may have slightly different wording here. The Net Bible goes with banish emotional stress from your mind, put away pain from your body. So anxiety, emotional stress, troubles, pain, you can see coming through there. The ESV had remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body. Now, I don't know about you, but the last time I used the word vexation, I can't even remember. It's not one of the words in my vocabulary, so I like some of the other translations better than that one. New American Standard Bible, remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body. So we've got anxiety, emotional stress, grief and anger, vexation for that matter, and then troubles and pain seem to be the ideas here. So Solomon's advice seems to be getting rid of anxiety and stress. And by the way, anxiety, those things that trouble the heart and the mind. That's not the way we need to live a healthy life. And we realize we've got mental health. We talk a lot about mental health today. And we realize the need to get our mental health right so that we can live a joyful life, a happy life. So anxiety, of course, the problem is a lot of anxiety, which leads to depression. It's not a matter of telling somebody, oh, just get over it. That just doesn't work. Instead, we've got to realize that sometimes we need extra help for that. But as much as we can control our thoughts, banish these things from our heart if we want to have a joyful life. Find ways of getting rid of these things. I think that's good advice. And that is his advice, is to get rid of them. Interesting the way he ends this sort of section here. Youth and vigor are meaningless. Again, depending on your translation, you're going to have something maybe slightly different. The Net Bible, youth and the prime of life are fleeting. I think we can relate to that. English Standard Version, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity, meaningless. I think what he's saying here is that youth isn't the answer to everything. It's not the be-all and end-all. There's something to say for the wisdom of age. Warren Wiersbe, in Be Satisfied, his commentary on Ecclesiastes, said the phrase means childhood and youth are transient. These precious years go by so quickly, and we must not waste our opportunities for preparing for the future. Youth is indeed the time of dawning, and before we know it, the sun will start to set. Therefore, make the most of these dawning years, because you will never see them again. I think he has the right idea there. Derek Kidner commented that to idolize the state of youth and to dread the loss of it is disastrous. It spoils the gift even while we have it. To see it instead as a passing phase, beautiful in its time, but not beyond it, is to be free from its frustrations. I think he had a very apt comment there, because isn't that what so many people today do? They want to hold on to their youth, and sometimes hold on to their youthful looks. And they'll take all manner of hair coloring. There's nothing wrong with hair coloring, by the way, but they'll do that, or they might get a facelift, do anything they can to try to stave off that they no longer look youthful. And by the way, sometimes when they have these facelifts, they end up with something that is absolutely hideous. I can't believe they think that looks good, but that's beside the point. Sometimes we dread the loss of youth. And rather, I think what Solomon's telling us is to embrace every stage of our life. And because life is sweet, and we need to enjoy it. Denny Petrillo wrote, God wants men to enjoy living. He wants his people to seize every opportunity to enjoy life, especially since life, childhood in the prime of life, is so short. It's fleeting. And Derek Kidner wrote, joy needs no pretenses to enhance it, but how it can survive in the face of death and the frustrations of the world is a secret which only the next chapter will begin to unfold. And so that signals that we have arrived at the end of chapter 11 and gives us a little bit of a look into where we're going to be headed in the final chapter. Joy needs nothing to enhance it. But in the face of death, how do we maintain joy? In the frustrations of the world, how do we maintain joy? And we're going to see some of that in the final chapter. Let's look at some lessons that we can learn from this chapter. Again, taken in roughly the order that we looked at these ideas. I think one thing we can see here is God wants us to be people of faith. He wants us to use what he blesses us with. He wants us to launch out sometimes when we can't see how the outcome will be. I think we can also see that our need to learn to trust in God. And again, that is so full. We find that so much in the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of the apostles as well. But yeah, we need to learn to trust God. We don't have the power to change a lot of things of life. Trust God and get on with doing what we can do. I think we can see that we need to use every opportunity that we have. Wisdom maintains that we should work every opportunity, remembering that no opportunity is going to be ideal. I think God wants us to live joyful lives. I think that's what Solomon's saying. I think we see that in the writings of the apostles as well. And I'd say going along with joyful, to have that joyful frame of life, we need to have an optimism. We need to have an enthusiasm about life. I think we see some of that coming through here in Solomon's writing as well. Solomon wants us to enjoy life, wants the young to enjoy life, but always remember we're going to be called to account for what we do. And so that's important. Yes, enjoy life, but it's enjoying life within boundaries, isn't it? Enjoying life as we can to please God. And then finally, we should enjoy every stage of our lives. I think that's important. The older I get, the more I'm enjoying each stage of my life. And this just entered a stage of having grandsons born. And I am thoroughly enjoying this stage of life. Having my grandsons, one is 3 weeks old and one is about 6-7 months old now. And I thoroughly enjoy, I guess he's almost 8 months old, but thoroughly enjoying having these boys as part of my life. Enjoy every stage of your life. Let me say just something. I like to do this when I'm teaching a class, just to mention something about the resources I've used. me mention just a few of them. You've heard me quote a lot from Derek Kidner, The Message of Ecclesiastes. It is quite a short commentary in the Bible Speaks Today series. I found that he has a lot of good things to say. I don't always agree with him. I don't always agree with most writers, out with biblical writers. But he does have, as you've seen, a lot of good things to say. I've also been quoting some from Knut Heim's Tyndall Old Testament commentary on Ecclesiastes. It's not what I really take his viewpoint on very often. He does have some nice things to say. His application, his time of writing is far different from what I would agree with. But nevertheless, I think he's got some things that are worthwhile saying. I've been mentioning Denny Petrillo, the Truth for Today commentary. Not available easily in the United Kingdom, is available in the United States. Published there in Searcy, Arkansas by Eddie Clower. And I found it to be quite useful. He's had some good things to say. I always like Warren Wiersbe's writings. Be Satisfied is his commentary on Ecclesiastes. And again, I always don't always agree with Wiersbe, but I always find he has some good applications, and that's useful. And I've been using the New Bible Commentary, and this New Bible Commentary, I think there's 2 newer editions of this one. This is the original New Bible Commentary that was published in 1953, and I continue to find useful information in it. There's a few other commentaries I've read as well. As you can see, I've not quoted from them, so therefore I'm not mentioning them here. Of course, the Net Bible Study Notes. The Net Bible can be found online, has its own website, and its translation notes I find very useful in talking about why a verse is translated the way it is. And maybe you'll find those useful as well. But I thought I'd just mention some of my resources in my penultimate lesson, and then next week we'll get on with the final lesson in this particular series, and hopefully be able to announce the new series that we'll be teaching from then on for the next 12 weeks.